Welcome to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Miley, an IFS-informed certified trauma recovery coach. This show features interviews from survivors all over the world as they share their impactful story of thriving in their post-traumatic growth. We explore resources, tools, and coping skills to support the trauma survivor community. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah, and I'm joined today with my two new friends, Anne and Avgi. Avgi Saketopoulou is a psychoanalyst in a private practice in New York City and a member of the faculty at the NYU postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. Thanks so much for joining us. And Anne Pellegrini is professor of performance studies and social and cultural analysis at NYU as well, and a psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City as well. Their previous books include Performance Anxiety, Staging Psychoanalysis, Staging Race, and the 2014 Lambda finalist in Best LGBT Nonfiction, You Can Tell Just by Looking, and 20 Other Myths About LGBTQ People and Life, which they co-authored. And they're here today with us because they have co-authored together, Avgi and Anne. They've co-authored a new book called Gender Without Identity. So thank you guys for being here. I just want to jump right in, give you the floor for a minute just to kind of share a little bit about yourself and how you've landed now together co-authoring this new book.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So whoever wants to go first, Avgi, I've got you on my top screen up here. So why don't you just share a little bit about yourself and how you've got here?
Yeah, so I'm an immigrant from Greece and from Cyprus, and I moved to the States to study psychoanalysis and found my way into working with the queer community, with a lot of trans people and trans children. I've been working with the queer community and especially with trans kids and their families for over 20 years now. I'm a clinical psychologist and a psychoanalyst, and I'm myself queer identified. And Anne and I have been working together for some time. And Anne, I don't know if you want to jump in and say a bit about yourself before I head on to talk about our book.
Yeah, please.
Sure. So as Sarah mentioned, I am a psychoanalyst in private practice, but I've come to psychoanalysis after an still ongoing, long career as a professor at the university level. So I've been actually teaching full time for almost 30 years now. And one of my specialty areas is LGBTQ studies. And so for a long time, I've been teaching classes sort of in introduction to gender and sexuality studies, for example, classes on the sexual politics of religion and the religious politics of sexuality in the US. And so I've been, thinking aloud with, undergraduates and graduate students for a long time about pressing issues of sexuality and gender in public life. And some of the very live questions that come up in the classroom have also appear in the clinic in my consulting room and with patients I work with in slightly different ways, but some similar questions having to do with what it's like to be gender non-normative and sexually queer in a world that still is hostile to trans and queer people. Mm-hmm. And also questions people have about how they became queer and how they became trans, and questions that feel dangerous even to ask. And so again, I've been tracking both in the classroom context and the clinic some of these questions. And I know that these are things that Avgi's been thinking about for a long, long time as a clinician. So these are things we started talking to each other about and puzzling over, like, how could we talk about things publicly that feel actually kind of scary and risky to talk about?
Yeah.
So we started with writing an article that kind of like for an academic journal in a professional, actually that we submitted for a pretty big award in psychoanalysis. We're very excited about it. And that article aimed to address some questions that are really very prominent in the field right now, not just in the field of psychoanalysis, but generally in mental health fields and in the wider culture, especially as the onslaughts against queer life are intensifying in the United States. And the questions that we sought out to take up is kind of like had to do with two things. First, how do we understand what is kind of like, is there a way to talk about the relationship between trauma and queer identity without that becoming transphobic or homophobic without tipping into conversion practices. And the other was, what do we think today about the question of a very prevalent idea of there being some true gender, true sexuality to each of us that one just needs to uncover, which is kind of like how affirming therapies are making their gestures to protect queer and trans people. And we came up with some pretty surprising, counterintuitive ways of thinking about these two questions that are very, very committed to protecting queer and trans people, but which try to do so from a very unusual angle.
Beautiful. It's like a match made in heaven here. Like you're both in these same fields with similar situations, but more importantly, similar questions. And like both being psychoanalysts, you guys, I know you love questions. So that's really, really exciting. The book bio says that trauma sometimes has a share in the acquisition of gender identity, and that conceptualizing trauma alongside diversity isn't about invalidating, but the illumination that the gender textures that they can flourish, they need to be enabled to flourish. So tell us more about that role that trauma has in acquiring these gender identities.
Maybe I'll say something first, and then I want to hand it over to Avgi. That, we're at a moment, right, where this is happening in the United States, but not just here. There are attacks happening on trans people. I mean, physical attacks, but also legislative attacks. In this country, for example, in 2023, more than 400 bills have been introduced in state legislatures, and actually might be more than 500 now, seeking to restrict access to trans affirmative care. These are bills that are attacking more widely LGBTQ life, but really focusing on trans people and trans kids in particular. So the arguments we're making are also our arguments. We're talking to clinicians, but they have a broader impact, right? And one of the things we're trying to do is intervene in how do we even talk about how someone becomes queer, becomes trans without it's being weaponized, right? And the first thing to say is there's nothing wrong with being queer, nothing wrong with being trans, and there's no wrong way to become it or be it, right? But because of these attacks on queer people, and especially on trans people, it seemed like the only way to safeguard and protect trans people is to say that gender is an inborn identity. And just as some people are born cisgender, like normatively male or female, other people are born trans or born, sort of gender non-binary. Because if we say anything else, we're opening up the prospect that someone who's trans was warped. Something bad must have happened to that person. Some trauma, some unfortunate event that warped what should be their true gender, right? So one of our interventions is to try to open up space to say, look, actually, gender is more complicated for everyone. Everybody acquires gender, not just trans people, not just gender non-binary people, everybody. Yeah. And maybe trauma has some role to play there, right? And that's a move we're making. And I want to hand it over to Avgi because this thinking about the relationship between trauma and gender is something she's also worked on in the book, her solo book that came out earlier this year as well.
Yeah, this idea of like gender as something we all acquire may sound really odd to people who are accustomed, as we have been as queer people ourselves, have been accustomed to the story that is most like the most progressive story in circulation, which is that, queer and trans people were just born this way. So they should be, the argument goes, they should be given credence, they should be given validity, they should be given rights, because that's just their innate nature, that's their authentic true self, and they should be allowed to express it. But there's something we find that is kind of like ethically short-sighted about arguing that trans people, for example, are valid because they were born this way, as if there were some reason that an excuse is needed to explain why it's okay to treat trans people with dignity. The reason why trans people are valid and queer people are valid is that diversity is part of our humanity. And that's it. Like, you don't need more reason to be worthy of being treated like a human being. But in the course of doing this thinking, like we also came to the following kind of like insight, which is that all human beings, cisgender human beings as well, come to acquire their gender. that it's not something that we're born into. It's not something that is marked by our genitals, by our chromosomes. It's not even marked by some deep internal sense of who we are. That's not the truth of who we are. But the question of how somebody experiences their gender is a result of multiple factors that combine in ways that have to do with a person's kind of like where they live, kind of like the family they grew up in, kind of like all kinds of emotional, social, and cultural factors. And the step that we took that feels to be the most risky, but also the most promising in our work, is to say that even trauma may have something to do with how somebody acquires their gender. And when we say that, we're not just saying this for queer and trans people, we're saying this for cis and straight people as well, that in many ways, the acquisition of normative gender is a traumatic acquisition. Like one of the examples that we like to bring sometimes is to talk about how people who were assigned female at birth and who understand themselves as women, meaning cisgender women, come into their womanhood partly through the violence of patriarchy and the violence of misogyny. And that doesn't invalidate the female gender experience that they have, but it does illuminate its texture. So there are certain kind of like, there's a way in which we have been so frightened to touch the question of trauma because it has been routinely used as a way of discrediting people whose identities are more diverse. So we have been arguing against the notion that there's something innate about this or the other identity, and trying to move the conversation more to thinking about how identities are transiently acquired, which means that they can also shift. So this notion that there is a core identity kind of like begins to fall away and give room to kind of like something that is more pliable and more flexible.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I love this idea of like the different textures of it, because not just gender, but also sexuality, right? I mean, there's going to be people who might steer away from intimate relationships or prefer ethical non-monogamy, or those who, are married right out of high school because of their upbringing, because of their whatever trauma they've gone through, right? And there's going to shift and bend the way that you look at, everything from romance to sexuality to gender identity in that way. So I find that really it's just a totally different view, and you're so right. We have continued to say, well, you're born this way, but this is quite controversial and surprising when you hear someone say, that this is something that's up for kind of discussion, to talk about how did we weave these fabrics of our lives. I just have to ask, have we gotten any backlash yet on this book? Are there people that are like vehemently opposed to this way of thinking?
So far we've been very gratified. We've had opportunities to talk about the book in numerous kinds of public settings as well as on podcasts, and people seem both intrigued by the argument, but even more than that, and especially for, I'm also queer identified, for a lot of the queer and trans people we're talking to, it makes a lot of sense, right? And by the way, we're not saying that no queer person or trans person is allowed to talk about their identity, their sense of their sexuality or their gender is inborn, because in fact, that is the way it feels to so many of us, right? It's not about invalidating how anyone, especially in this homophobic and transphobic context, comes to tell the story of themselves and assert themselves. We're not invalidating that. But for many queer and trans people, we don't tell the story of ourselves. We don't understand our experiences as innate, right? In fact, so part of what we're experiencing when we talk about this book and in public is a lot of people saying, oh my gosh, yes, that actually really resonates. And they have the permission, we experience this with patients certainly, being given the permission to start to be curious about how your gender might have developed, and your sexuality might have developed, and where that curiosity isn't going to sort of suddenly hit the wall of judgment or condemnation. I mean, that is so important, to be allowed to wonder about oneself.
Right. And it's important to emphasize here that when we're talking about having room to do that kind of inquiry, we're talking about a self-inquiry. We're not talking about clinicians stepping in and expecting queer and trans people to account for themselves, to to justify their existence or justify their gender or their sexuality. And this is kind of like the very, very nuanced but important distinction that we're making from models that say, actually, trans people are traumatized people, and therefore they should be fixed and returned back to the normativity that is cisgender identity. And that's why when you used earlier, Sarah, the word kind of like bent, like part of what we're saying is that kind of like everybody's bent towards a direction, because there is no one or right direction. There's no way to be wrong in one's gender, and there's no way to be right, objectively right in one's gender. The gender that works for each person is the gender that that person is. And that should be enough. We should stop as clinicians looking for methods to discern if somebody's truly trans or whether somebody's like mistaken. And we see right now, especially like I work with kids, as I said at the beginning, and right now there is like so much panic around the notion that trans kids are not really trans. They just caught it from the internet. They caught it from the wrong friends. Too many kids in school are identifying this way, and they're just getting carried away by that influence. This notion that kind of like there's something fundamentally deeply wrong about being trans is part of what makes it difficult to also talk about the role of trauma in the constitution of all genders. So I thought that that was a very important point to make, because cisgenders too are also created out of these processes. And cis people when we work in clinical moments in long-term work, where we do like long-term psychoanalytic work, I see patients multiple times a week, sometimes for years on end. Cis people get to tell complex stories about their genders all the time. They get to say things like, my dad was like this, and that's not the kind of man I want to be. Or my dad was like this, and therefore I don't want to be kind of like the kind of man that would be with a man like that. So cis people get to elaborate their genders in relation to traumatic experience all the time. So we wanted to afford this kind of dignity to people whose genders and sexualities are not normatively organized, so that they can also have the complexity that cis people are routinely afforded.
Now, can I ask a question for either of you? It just made me think about this whole catching trends on the internet kind of thing, because it's really popular on TikTok. Is that still a valid kind of option of truth, that maybe they are catching it on there because now there's a permission to explore? And so just the way we used to catch being cis and heteronormative, because that's what everyone did and that's what we saw, right? So is there, am I on a path? I'm seeing smiles, so I'm going to just be quiet and let you guys answer. Know where I'm going.
Yeah, Sarah, I think you're bringing up something really important, right? Is that we're bombarded with images from the moment we arrive in this world, right? And not only, and even before our arrival, so often the parent or parents know the quote unquote sex of the child, right? This has been, sort of told them during an ultrasound, right? So there's all these gendered expectations. So even before we arrive in the scene, gender is in play for us. And then here we are, this little neonate, bombarded with images. You're going to grow up in popular culture that has, celebrates, sort of heterosexual romance, all sorts of things, right? So that is shaping of gender and sexuality. But now we also have more and more images of trans people, of people who do their gender differently. Why wouldn't then more young people be coming to identify as genderqueer in some way, as trans, gender non-binary? Because these are now possibilities presented to them, right? So we shouldn't think of this as a contagion. We should think about this as a widening of the possibilities.
The word contagion is so critical here, because of course contagion implies an infection. It implies kind of like an illness, a pathology, like a pathogen, right? So very critical to the distinction that you were just making, Sarah, is exactly what kind of like Anne was pointing to, which I'm going to say a little bit differently, which is that of course we get affected from things that we see around us. The problem with the notion of contagion is that it imagines that there's a one-to-one correspondence between what you see in the internet and then what you imitate. And you imitate it as, not because it activates something in you, or because in some way it clicks with something in you, but because you get carried away and tricked into misunderstanding yourself. And it's precisely there that this notion of misunderstanding yourself, like that the notion of like some core gender identity becomes very operative, like that, because the idea is we're all cis, kind of like we're all born to be in alliance with the gender we were accorded at birth. But it's only some people who end up counter-identifying or identifying outside of that binary, who have in some way been bent out of shape, and they have been seduced or tricked, or they're too vulnerable, they're too young, they're too traumatized, they are too positionally kind of like they're too poor or too mentally ill or too non-white or too disabled to be able to know what's truly going on, which the story goes is to be cis. So kind of like the critical distinction here is that, of course, we get everything that plays out around us affects us. So it's not an accident that as more people are coming out, more people are coming out. But that's not a one-to-one correspondence. And from that perspective, which is the perspective of ROGD, the rapid onset gender dysphoria category that has been circulating in the last few years, and which kind of like from a research perspective, there's more and more studies that are coming out that are suggesting that this may not be the right category, that there's all kinds of problems with how that research was done, with how those samples were collected, even though it appeals to parents who just want the complexity of what's going on to go away, partly out of protectiveness of their kids and sometimes out of their own anxiety.
Yeah. So is there room here, and I know I'm straying from my question, so I'm sorry to kind of pop some ones on here for you, but is there something to be said for saying that trauma has maybe a majority role in someone's sexuality or gender identity? As someone's healing from trauma, there's still the ability for them to move and ebb and flow into possibly a different space, right? Maybe wanting to go back to their cis sex that they were assigned at birth. Is there room to, like, what is, I guess I know I'm hearing the argument, right, in the news that, once they're out of the bad situation and once they find healing, then have they made a horrible decision, especially for trans people, if they've actually done surgical things, right? And is that trauma healing actually going to then remold back to where they maybe thought that they were going to go before they started transitioning into queer or non-binary or whatever it may be?
I'm really grateful for this question. I think it's exactly the right question. And it's the question that has really captured the panic. It's generating a lot of panic right now. And I want to speak from a case example for a moment. We speak in our book in Gender Without Identity, we speak about a colleague of ours whose name is Jack Pula, who's an out trans man, who actually writes a paper to talk to the professional community about how it's in the course of his healing that he came to recognize that he's a trans man. So rather than the usual story that we're being fed and that is generating all of this anxiety, that if you heal, you return to your ostensibly normal gender, and I'm putting normal in quotes, which is a cisgender. Part of what we find in this particular case is somebody who, through the process of doing a lot of work on themselves in a deep way, in an ongoing way with their analysts over a certain amount of time. So this is not a superficial, like 2-session therapy or somebody who's like rushing into things, comes to understand that actually part of their health for themselves is in their transness. This is not to say that trans is the healthy gender any more than to say that cis is the healthy gender. There is no healthy or unhealthy gender. It's more about the relationship that everybody has with their gender. And that relationship cannot be dictated by doctors, by legislators, by therapists, or by parents.
And the other important thing to say is that we're talking about, since we're moving away from the notion of a true gender that you discover once and for all, we're talking about a goodness of fit. In what gender, what allows you to flourish, right? And that goodness of fit can change. People do, in fact, change in how they understand their genders. This change may be registered in shifting in terms of a pronoun, moving from, let's say, she to they. But people also can shift again, right? So that it is indeed quite possible that someone can come to understand themselves as trans and transition, even, sort of doing some kind of medical treatment, maybe hormones, maybe even a surgery, and then come to understand themselves anew and transition again. Right now, there's the word detransition that's circulating a lot. Yeah. And the idea is that this person transitioned, but it was a mistake. They're going to detransition and go back to their original cisness. We prefer to speak of retransition because it's also to really mark that we can keep changing. And we change in directions that nobody can predict, least of all the clinician. But we ourselves, in our own journey, we can't predict it either. Yeah. That's the surprise and strangeness of gender.
Yeah. And that retransition does not necessarily have to go towards a cis direction. Somebody who's trans-identified could become identified and could identify themselves as non-binary. Like that's also a different kind of transition from one gender to another. And these kinds of shifts need not panic us, and they need not scare parents who, of course, should be working and getting advice when they need it from professionals who are experienced in these areas, because there's so much problematic information out there, and so much information that is preying on parents' anxieties about their kids and their fears, and the fantasy that all parents have, that all they want is that if their kid is in the most normative position, then that makes them more likely to be happy, which is not true.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I want to read another little piece of the book bio that says that the book argues for the recognition that the wounding and trauma are spun into gender, and self-theorizations don't proceed from a centered self. So what, we've already kind of talked a little bit about the argument here, but you're more than welcome to dive in. But what was the definition for you guys in writing that idea of like this centered self? What does that mean to you? Because I'm a trauma recovery coach and I practice with IFS. And so for me, a centered self means something possibly different. So I just want to clarify that. And what was that argument there about that spinning gender identity that way?
So these, there's this very popular idea, both in pop psychology, but also in fields like psychoanalysis, that there is some core self at the center of the person, and all kinds of experiences issue from that self. So that there's your true gender is there, your true nature is there, whether you're a kind person or an evil person, whether you're a male person or a female person, whether you're somebody who really needs to have children or somebody who really needs to be in a relationship, those sorts of things. And like our cultures right now, our therapeutic cultures and our social cultures are very invested in this notion that there is an interiority to us, that like if given the space can be expressed truly, and then if that happens, one will be happy. But that leaves out a lot of things that are very important. First of all, the fact that as psychoanalysts, we don't believe that there is a centered self, because we always believe that there are aspects of one's experience and one's psyche that are not, of which one is not conscious, and that they work not by being centered but by interrupting what we think of as our centeredness. So for example, like, our dreams do not come from a part of ourselves that is organized and thinking and wants something, and it just needs the space to be given what it wants. They produce things that may be surprising to us. They may reveal desires to us or fears or oddities about our relationships with others that were unacceptable to us or that we would never imagine are ours. So that already begins to show that there's something off-center, something decentered about us. And then when you add the fact that we live in a social world that is constantly in interaction with the social environment, with the cultural environment, the idea of a centered self begins to feel more and more illusory. So in talking about trauma and about the spinning, to get to your question about spinning, like part of how somebody creates a self is by taking these materials and spinning a story. And if the story works well enough, that's great. And then if it works well enough, it comes to feel like it's your own. It comes to feel like this is my story, this is me. And if it doesn't work well enough, you get these experiences where people say, I don't feel like myself. I feel something is off. So trauma has a share in how those stories get spent. And much like other materials that become ingredients for this story, trauma too can become an ingredient of the story. Like we can think of people whose creativity and identities as artists have been very much inflected through trauma. And that doesn't make them people who should be fixed. It makes them human beings who are imperfect, like we all are. And then you do things with trauma as opposed to doing things about trauma so that you can get rid of it. So a lot, this idea that things can be done with trauma, which is an idea that we call traumatophilia in the book, stands at a harsh opposition with the ways in which we are phobic in our cultures of trauma, phobic of the fact, kind of like phobic in the sense that we assume that trauma just destroys you, it just breaks you, and that's all that can come from trauma.
Yeah. It's really important to emphasize the ways in which people do things with their trauma, and to say they do things with their trauma isn't to say that they're just healing from it, like actively doing things with it, but also the doing we're talking about isn't about like a volitional project, like let me sit down and do something with our trauma. We're talking about things that are happening also in some sense beneath our direct consciousness, but they're shaping the ways in which we get to be an agent in the world, right? They become sources for us, resources for us.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's almost, a lot of people think that there's like a fragmentation that happens, right, with trauma, which can be true, I guess, for some people, right? But it's like you still are the box that contains all those puzzle pieces. So if they're a little bit broken apart, you can dump it out and you can rebuild, and now you can make something that you want to be more of that like authentic self for what's true for yourself. And I love this idea of like doing with and like having it with you, because I'm always talking about how we're not going to move on from our trauma.
Mm-hmm.
It is here like a shadow, but we can move forward with it. That's exactly the way that I put that. So I really appreciate that. How can we as a society, how can we have these open conversations about trauma roles in gender identity? How can we do that when we're not, NYU professors and psychoanalysts with a lot of titles and a lot of degrees? How can we just openly do this without, crossing lines into, offending or hurting someone?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. Well, one avenue is the conversation we're having right now, because this conversation will be accessible to people that aren't in an NYU classroom or aren't in our therapy room. So it's important to multiply the sites where we can have these more complex conversations. And it's also the case, and this was also part of what gave Avgi and me the courage to write this book, because we were also a little scared of our argument. Yeah. We didn't want to make arguments and put them out in public that would be weaponized against queer and trans people, a community we belong to ourselves. But part of our inspiration was that we were talking to other queer and trans people who, it's not clinicians who are also hearing stories from their patients, but whose own self-accounts aren't about being born that way. This is not how I would narrate my own identity. So we want to tell more complex stories. And I'm hearing the hunger in my students, that they who are persuaded by the kinds of accounts historians of sexuality have offered, theorists of gender have offered, that talk about the social construction of gender and sexuality, that it gets assembled differently in different cultures and at different times. They're persuaded by it, but they still want to know, well, okay, yes, but what made me fill in the blank, queer or gay or trans or cis? Like, I get this, the macro level analysis, but how do I get to have that conversation, right? So I think it's about trying to lower the stakes a little bit and listen to the conversations that are already happening, but which people have been, for good reason, nervous to have in too big a public space.
Yeah. I mean, this is such a great response. And one thing that I would add is like right now, the like part of what the stakes are organized around is this question of regret. Like, what if somebody transitions and they regret it? What if somebody has a surgery and they regret it? And I want to say two things about that may or not be familiar to your audience. The first is that the rates of regret for gender-related surgeries are minuscule compared to the rates of regret for knee surgeries and for back surgeries. Like, the levels of success that we see with gender-related surgeries would be considered absolutely phenomenal in any other field. They're not 100%, but the idea, they are kind of like in the 90s, well into the 90s. So the idea that a surgery that performs at like in the 90s, percentage-wise, is seen as a worrisome one, where knee surgeries and back surgeries are not treated the same way, tells us more about the kinds of fears that we have about gender and about bodily autonomy than they do about regret. So that's the one thing that I wanted to say. The other thing is that people get to make decisions and regret them all the time. And I say this not to be like nonchalant about the costs of a decision that is made and changed, but people get married, people have children. These decisions affect other people. They create lives. As a clinician, I will say I have worked with more than one person who was born to a family that perhaps should not have had children. They really affect lives, but we do not see the same level of policing over those kinds of decisions that are equally consequential as we do in some areas of trans-related healthcare. So that should really give us pause and make us think. Like, you don't need to be a professor or a psychoanalyst to wonder about why is it different?
Yeah. Wow. Very thought-provoking. I really appreciate the both of you so much. This podcast really likes to focus on resources, right? So if we were thinking about someone that we know, any of the audience members listening, someone who's healing from trauma while they're also unspinning this gender identity, what's some advice? What are some resources that you might share with that person that they can give to their loved one or for themselves?
Wow, that's such a great question. I mean, I'm particularly enamored. I know Avgi loves this book as well. Like, I want to send people to the bookstore, right, to get different books, like the Transgender Studies Reader. I think it's in its second edition. That's an amazing resource. I love a recent book by Marquise Bay, System Failure, CIS, System Failure. It's a beautiful book that's also an intervention in Black studies. And then, of course, this classic novel, Stone Butch Blues, by Leslie Feinberg. That's just, essential reading. So again, this is like my geeky professor, like, it's just like, let's go to the bookstore. But that there are resources of fiction and nonfiction that I think can be very helpful, not in providing a settled answer, but just like blowing your mind out.
Yeah, and giving that introspective ability, the permission to be introspective about it. Yeah. Anything to add, Avgi?
Yes, I would also add a couple of books. I will add a novel. I would add Detransition Baby, which is a novel that is taking up a way of thinking about, it shows you a way of thinking about detransitioning through tracking the story of somebody who detransitioned and transitions into a new kind of life that is not cis, and it's not normative, and it's not straight, but opens up to different possibilities. And I think it's a very good novel. It's very well written, and it tells a more complex story than we're accustomed to hearing. And for those who are interested in thinking more about trans children, I can't recommend highly enough Jules Gill-Peterson's work, the histories of the transgender child, which is a book that shows that trans children are not new. They have existed for a very long time, and that the story that it's a new phenomenon, or that all of a sudden we have like an onslaught of trans kids, therefore we need to explain the phenomena, is actually historically unsubstantiated.
Yeah. Wow. Beautiful, beautiful. And I'm going to have all those written out, and I'll have links to those books in the show notes below. Avgi, and thank you so much for joining us. Tell people if they wanted to reach out to you or they want to learn any more about your books. Both of you have your own books, and now we have the book together, Gender Without Identity. So where can people find you? And I'll link it all below in the show notes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I am on Instagram, which is where I'm the most active. I am at Avgolis98, Avgolis98. I also read reviews that people post, and I interact with those who write reviews. So if anybody wants to review the book and wants to write to us, there's information on my website, avgisaketopoulou.com. I'd love to hear from people who have read the book and have thoughts to share. So I would really invite that kind of contact.
Yeah, I also love to hear from readers, because basically readers offer us ways to think about a book differently. Mm-hmm. I can be found on Instagram too at apel168, so APELL 168. And yeah, please reach out. Love to hear your thoughts about the book. And you can get the book online through uitbooks.com. We published the book with a very small press. It's a small but mighty, so you can get the book directly through them. They also have a link to that big online bookseller whose name I will not mention. And it will soon be available for bookstores to order. So you'll soon be able to go into your independent bookstore, support your local independent bookstore, and request the book, and they'll be able to get the book in stock for you.
Excellent.
But until then, uitbooks.com.
Excellent. Yes. And I will link all that up, and we'll have everything in the show notes. Thank you so much, Avgi and Anne. Have a great rest of your evening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for this conversation.
You're welcome. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to or watching this episode of the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. Please subscribe, like, share, and follow. For any information that was discussed in this podcast episode, check out the show notes below. Until next time, be well.